Peter Abelard begins his philosophy with a conviction that would make him one of the most controversial and influential thinkers of the Middle Ages. Reason is not the enemy of faith, and genuine belief becomes stronger when it is examined rather than merely accepted. In an age where many people considered authority sufficient grounds for certainty, he insisted that human beings possess the capacity and responsibility to think carefully, question deeply, and seek understanding through rational inquiry. This commitment to intellectual investigation would shape not only his own philosophy, but the development of medieval thought for centuries to come. At the heart of his philosophy lies the belief that truth should not be feared. If something is genuinely true, then honest questioning cannot destroy it. Doubt, therefore, becomes an important starting point rather than a threat. He famously argues that through doubt we come to inquiry, and through inquiry we arrive at truth. Instead of treating uncertainty as weakness, he sees it as the beginning of genuine understanding. People who never question may possess confidence, but confidence alone is not knowledge. Knowledge requires examination. This approach leads him to challenge a common tendency among human beings, the desire to accept conclusions simply because respected authorities endorse them. Throughout history, individuals have often relied upon tradition, institutions, teachers, or cultural assumptions to determine what they believe. While authority can provide valuable guidance, Abelard insists that it cannot replace personal understanding. A belief held without reflection remains incomplete because the mind has not yet grasped why it is true. His commitment to reason does not mean he rejects faith. On the contrary, he remains deeply religious throughout his life. Yet he believes faith and reason should work together rather than exist in opposition. Faith provides orientation toward truths that transcend ordinary experience, while reason helps clarify, interpret, and understand those truths more fully. A mature intellectual life, therefore, requires both humility before mystery and courage in investigation. This balance becomes especially visible in his treatment of contradictions. He notices that respected authorities sometimes appear to disagree with one another. Sacred texts, theological writings, and philosophical traditions often contain passages that seem difficult to reconcile. Rather than ignoring these tensions, he brings them into the open. Contradictions should not be hidden. They should be examined carefully because the effort to resolve them frequently leads to deeper understanding. For Abelard, intellectual growth occurs through dialogue. Human beings learn by comparing arguments, evaluating evidence, and testing ideas against one another. Truth emerges not from passive acceptance, but from active engagement. When different perspectives encounter one another, weaknesses become visible, assumptions are challenged, and understanding becomes more refined. Philosophy, therefore, requires conversation rather than mere repetition. This emphasis on dialogue reflects a broader confidence in human reason. He believes the mind possesses remarkable capacities for analysis and reflection. Human beings are capable of distinguishing between stronger and weaker arguments, identifying inconsistencies, and moving gradually toward clearer understanding. Reason is not perfect, but it remains one of humanity's greatest gifts because it enables people to participate consciously in the search for truth. One of his most important philosophical contributions concerns the problem of universals, a debate that occupied medieval thinkers for generations. The question appears abstract at first, but concerns a fundamental issue about reality itself. When people use general terms such as humanity, justice, beauty, or goodness, what exactly do these words refer to? Do universal concepts exist independently? Or are they merely names applied to collections of individual things? Some thinkers argued that universals possess a kind of independent reality beyond particular objects. Others claimed that only individual things exist and that general concepts are nothing more than words. Abelard seeks a middle path. He argues that universals do not exist as separate entities floating beyond the world, yet they are not meaningless labels either. Rather, They reflect the mind's ability to recognize similarities among individual things and organize experience through concepts. This position reveals an important feature of his thought. Human understanding does not simply mirror reality passively. The mind actively participates in making sense of the world. Concepts help individuals navigate complexity by identifying patterns and relationships. Knowledge, therefore, involves both external reality and the intellectual activity through which reality becomes intelligible. As his philosophy develops further, he becomes increasingly interested in ethics, and here he introduces ideas that would prove remarkably influential. Many moral systems focus primarily on external actions. They evaluate behavior according to what individuals do. Abelard, however, shifts attention toward intention. The moral value of an action depends significantly upon the inner purpose motivating it. This emphasis on intention transforms the way he thinks about right and wrong. Two individuals may perform the same outward action while possessing entirely different moral responsibilities because their intentions differ. Likewise, someone may commit an error honestly while seeking what they believe to be right, whereas another person may perform a seemingly correct action for selfish or harmful reasons. The inner orientation of the will, therefore, becomes crucial for moral evaluation. He does not deny the importance of actions, but he insists that morality cannot be understood adequately without considering consciousness and intention. Human beings are moral agents because they possess the capacity to choose knowingly. What matters most is not merely the external event, but the relationship between knowledge, intention, and decision. This focus on intention reflects his broader concern with personal responsibility. Individuals cannot hide behind custom, authority, or social expectations entirely. Each person must engage their own conscience and reason. Moral life requires reflection because responsibility belongs ultimately to the individual who chooses rather than to external systems alone. Conscience becomes particularly important within this framework. Abelard believes that human beings possess an inner awareness capable of guiding moral judgment. Conscience is not infallible, but it represents a serious dimension of ethical life. Acting against one's sincere understanding of what is right damages integrity, because it involves a deliberate rejection of one's own moral awareness. At the same time, he recognizes the importance of humility. Human beings are capable of error. They misunderstand situations, possess incomplete information, and sometimes reach mistaken conclusions. Because of this, intellectual and moral growth require openness to correction. The pursuit of truth depends upon a willingness to revise beliefs when better understanding emerges. Throughout all these reflections, a distinctive vision of human life begins to appear. Human beings are rational creatures called not merely to obey, but to understand. They are capable of inquiry, reflection, dialogue, and moral responsibility. Truth is not something imposed mechanically from outside, but something toward which individuals move through questioning, learning, and careful thought. For Abelard, philosophy becomes an act of intellectual courage. It requires the willingness to doubt without falling into despair, to question without abandoning faith, and to seek understanding even when answers remain difficult. The mind should neither submit blindly nor rebel recklessly. Instead, it should pursue wisdom through disciplined inquiry, trusting that reason, properly used, can illuminate the path toward deeper truth and a more authentic understanding of both reality and oneself. As Peter Abelard's philosophy continues to unfold, his attention increasingly turns toward the nature of human responsibility, because he believes that many people misunderstand morality by focusing too heavily on outward behavior while neglecting the inner life from which actions arise. Human beings often judge one another according to visible results. Yet visible results alone do not reveal the complete moral reality of a situation. To understand whether an action is truly good or bad, one must look deeper into the intention, knowledge, and consent of the person acting. This conviction leads him to develop one of the most original ethical theories of the medieval world. He argues that sin does not primarily consist in external actions themselves, but in the conscious decision to act against what one sincerely believes to be right. The moral center of human life, therefore, lies within the will. What matters most is not simply what happens outwardly, but what the individual knowingly chooses inwardly. This position creates a more complex picture of morality than many people expect. An individual may perform an action that produces harmful consequences without intending harm, while another person may act with malicious intentions, even if circumstances prevent those intentions from being carried out. In both cases, the inner orientation of the will remains morally significant. Human beings are responsible not only for what they do, but for what they knowingly choose. For Abelard, conscience becomes essential because it represents the individual's awareness of moral obligation. People are not merely creatures responding automatically to external commands. They possess the capacity to reflect, evaluate, and make judgments about what ought to be done. Conscience, therefore, serves as an important guide, helping individuals navigate situations where simple rules may not provide complete answers. Yet he is careful not to treat conscience as automatically correct in every case. Human beings are limited. They make mistakes. They misunderstand circumstances and sometimes reach false conclusions despite sincere efforts. Because of this, conscience must be educated through reflection, study, dialogue, and humility. The goal is not simply to follow personal feelings, but to seek genuine understanding of what is true and good. This emphasis upon inner moral awareness gives his philosophy a deeply personal character. Responsibility cannot be transferred entirely to authorities, traditions, or institutions. While guidance from others remains valuable, each individual must ultimately confront moral decisions personally. One cannot excuse wrongdoing merely by claiming obedience to external expectations. The conscience remains involved because human beings possess the capacity for judgment. His reflections on ethics naturally connect with his broader understanding of human freedom. Abelard believes moral life would be impossible without freedom because genuine responsibility requires the ability to choose. If individuals were completely determined by external forces, praise and blame would lose much of their meaning. Moral evaluation depends upon the fact that people possess at least some capacity to direct their actions according to reason and intention. Freedom, however, does not mean acting without limits or consequences. Rather, it means possessing the ability to make meaningful choices. Human beings constantly face decisions about what they will value, pursue, accept, or reject. Through these decisions, character gradually takes shape. A person's life becomes the cumulative result of countless choices made over time. He also becomes increasingly interested in the relationship between knowledge and morality. Ignorance can affect responsibility because people cannot be held accountable in exactly the same way for actions they do not understand. Yet ignorance itself can sometimes result from negligence. Individuals have responsibilities not only concerning their actions, but also concerning their efforts to learn, reflect, and seek truth. Moral maturity, therefore, requires intellectual effort as well as ethical commitment. This connection between knowledge and virtue helps explain why he values education so highly. Learning is not merely the acquisition of information. It contributes to the formation of character by expanding understanding and improving judgment. A more informed individual is often better equipped to recognize moral complexities and make responsible decisions. Dialogue remains central throughout this process. Abelard believes that truth becomes clearer when ideas are examined critically from multiple perspectives. Disagreement should not always be feared because it can reveal hidden assumptions and weaknesses in reasoning. Honest debate serves the pursuit of wisdom by forcing individuals to defend their beliefs thoughtfully rather than relying upon habit or authority alone. This approach reflects his broader confidence in rational inquiry. Human beings may never achieve perfect knowledge, but they can move closer to truth through disciplined investigation. Questions are not obstacles to understanding. They're often the path toward it. Intellectual growth, depends upon the willingness to examine beliefs carefully rather than accepting them passively. His philosophy therefore challenges both blind certainty and complete skepticism. Blind certainty assumes that questioning is unnecessary because all important answers are already known. Skepticism assumes that genuine knowledge may be impossible altogether. Abelard seeks a middle path. He believes truth exists and can be approached through reason, yet he also recognizes the limitations of human understanding and the need for ongoing inquiry. As these ideas develop, a larger vision of human life begins to emerge. Human beings are neither passive recipients of truth nor isolated creators of it. They participate in a continuous process of seeking understanding through reason, reflection, conversation, and moral effort. Knowledge grows through questioning. Character develops through responsible choice. Wisdom arises from the union of intellectual honesty and ethical seriousness. For Abelard, philosophy is ultimately an expression of respect for both truth and human dignity. To think carefully is to honor the capacities of the mind. To act according to conscience is to honor the responsibilities of the soul. The search for wisdom, therefore, requires more than intelligence alone. It demands courage, humility, patience, and a willingness to remain committed to understanding even when certainty remains incomplete. And so his philosophical journey continues to move toward a vision in which reason and morality work together, guiding individuals toward deeper self-knowledge, greater responsibility, and a more thoughtful engagement with reality, while reminding them that genuine wisdom is found not in the absence of questions, but in the disciplined and sincere pursuit of answers. As Peter Abelard's philosophy continues to deepen, he becomes increasingly interested in the relationship between understanding and faith, because he lives in a world where many people assume that questioning religious beliefs weakens them. Abelard takes the opposite view. He believes that beliefs which cannot endure honest examination remain fragile, while beliefs that survive careful inquiry become stronger and more meaningful. The goal of reason is not to destroy faith, but to illuminate it, helping individuals move from mere acceptance toward genuine understanding. This conviction reflects a broader principle running throughout his thought. Human beings are not meant to live passively within inherited ideas. Tradition has value, authority has value, and wisdom from the past deserves respect. Yet none of these should eliminate the responsibility to think. A person who repeats words without understanding them possesses information, but not wisdom. True understanding requires the active engagement of the mind. For this reason, Abelard frequently encourages intellectual humility. The pursuit of truth begins with the recognition that one does not already possess complete knowledge. Pride becomes an obstacle because it closes the mind to correction and learning. Individuals who believe they already know everything rarely grow. By contrast, those willing to acknowledge uncertainty remain open to deeper insight. Humility, however, does not mean intellectual weakness. It does not require abandoning reason or accepting contradictions without examination. Rather, it means recognizing both the power and the limitations of human understanding. People can discover much through inquiry, but they must also remain aware that their knowledge is never perfect. Wisdom, therefore, requires confidence in reason combined with awareness of its boundaries. This balance becomes particularly important in his understanding of dialogue. Abelard sees conversation not merely as a way of exchanging opinions, but as a method for approaching truth itself. Different perspectives reveal different aspects of reality. When individuals engage one another honestly, they expose weaknesses in arguments, clarify concepts, and refine their understanding. Disagreement, when approached constructively, becomes an opportunity for learning rather than a threat. He believes many conflicts persist because people are more interested in victory than understanding. They enter discussions seeking to defeat opponents rather than discover what is true. Such conversations often generate hostility without producing wisdom. Genuine dialogue requires a different attitude, one that values truth above personal pride. The aim should not be to win arguments, but to see reality more clearly. This commitment to rational discussion reflects his confidence in the capacity of human beings to learn and improve. People make mistakes, hold false beliefs, and misunderstand one another. Yet they also possess the ability to revise their views when confronted with better evidence or stronger reasoning. Intellectual growth depends upon this willingness to change. Without it, inquiry becomes impossible because conclusions are determined in advance. As these reflections develop, Abelard's philosophy reveals a profound respect for the dignity of the individual mind. Every person possesses the capacity for reflection, judgment, and moral responsibility. Human beings are not merely followers of authority or products of custom. They are rational agents capable of participating in the search for truth. This capacity gives individuals both freedom and obligation. They must think carefully because their choices matter. His ethical thought continues to evolve alongside these ideas. Since intention occupies the center of moral life, self-knowledge becomes increasingly important. People often judge themselves according to external appearances, focusing on how they seem to others rather than examining their actual motives. Yet true moral evaluation requires honesty about one's inner life. Individuals must ask not only what they have done, but why they have done it. This inward focus does not encourage isolation from others. On the contrary, understanding oneself often improves one's understanding of other people. Recognizing personal weaknesses can foster compassion because it reveals how difficult moral life can be. Human beings frequently struggle with conflicting desires, incomplete knowledge, and uncertain circumstances. Awareness of these struggles encourages humility in judging others. He also believes that moral progress is possible. Human beings are not fixed permanently in their current condition. Through reflection, education, discipline, and sincere effort, individuals can develop greater wisdom and integrity over time. Character is not simply inherited. It is formed gradually through choices, habits, and experiences. Every decision contributes to the kind of person one becomes. This emphasis on growth gives his philosophy a hopeful dimension. Mistakes need not define an entire life. Error can become a source of learning when individuals respond to it honestly. The important question is not whether people ever fail, because failure is unavoidable, but whether they use those failures as opportunities for deeper understanding and moral improvement. Throughout these reflections, truth remains the guiding principle. Abelard believes that reality is ultimately intelligible, even if human understanding remains incomplete. The search for truth is worthwhile because truth exists independently of personal preference or social approval. Individuals may disagree about many things, but through patient inquiry and honest dialogue, they can move closer to a more accurate understanding of the world and themselves. His vision of philosophy, therefore, becomes remarkably dynamic. Wisdom is not a static possession acquired once and for all. It is an ongoing process of questioning, learning, correcting, and growing. The philosopher is not someone who has finished seeking, but someone committed to seeking well. Curiosity, humility, and perseverance become essential virtues because the journey toward understanding never truly ends. As his thought reaches greater maturity, a distinctive image of human life emerges. People are rational and moral beings called to participate actively in the pursuit of truth. They must examine beliefs rather than accept them blindly, follow conscience while striving to educate it, and engage others through dialogue rather than domination. The path is often difficult because certainty remains incomplete and mistakes remain possible. Yet this very struggle forms part of what gives human existence its dignity. And so Abelard continues to defend a vision of life in which reason and faith, inquiry and humility, freedom and responsibility are not enemies, but partners, working together to guide individuals toward greater wisdom, deeper understanding, and a more thoughtful engagement with the mysteries of existence. As Peter Abelard brings his philosophy to its final conclusions, everything returns to a simple but powerful conviction. Human beings honor truth best not through blind acceptance, but through sincere understanding. The mind was not given merely to repeat what has been told. It was given to inquire, reflect, compare, judge, and seek wisdom. Questioning is therefore not a threat to truth. When guided by honesty and humility, it becomes one of the paths that lead toward it. Throughout his thought, reason and faith remain partners rather than rivals. Faith provides direction and meaning, while reason helps clarify what is believed and why it is believed. Neither should attempt to eliminate the other. A life guided only by authority risks becoming passive, while a life guided only by intellectual pride risks losing sight of deeper truths. Wisdom emerges when inquiry is balanced with humility. His ethical philosophy ultimately centers on the inner life of the individual. What matters most is not merely the appearance of actions, but the intention behind them. Human beings are moral creatures because they possess conscience, freedom, and the capacity to choose knowingly. A person must therefore take responsibility not only for what they do, but for the motives and decisions that shape their actions. This emphasis on intention gives his philosophy a deeply personal character. Each individual must examine their own conscience honestly. They cannot rely entirely upon custom, tradition, or external authority to determine moral responsibility. The search for what is right requires reflection, self-knowledge, and a sincere commitment to truth. At the same time, he never forgets the importance of humility. Human understanding remains limited. People make mistakes, misunderstand situations, and reach false conclusions despite good intentions. Because of this, the pursuit of wisdom requires openness to correction. Learning continues throughout life, and no one possesses complete understanding. Dialogue, therefore, remains essential. Through conversation, debate, and thoughtful disagreement, individuals refine their ideas and move closer to truth. The goal is not victory over others, but greater understanding. Genuine inquiry values truth more than pride and wisdom more than certainty. In the end, Peter Abelard offers a philosophy of intellectual courage. He encourages individuals to think without fear, to question without arrogance, and to believe without abandoning reason. Human beings are called to seek understanding actively, to follow conscience sincerely, and to remain committed to truth even when answers are difficult to find. And so his final message is one of thoughtful responsibility. Doubt can become the beginning of wisdom. Inquiry can become the path to understanding. And a life devoted to truth, guided by reason and humility together, can lead the human mind closer to both knowledge and genuine moral integrity. Long before universities became institutions filled with lecture halls, examinations, and academic departments, there lived a man whose life would become one of the most dramatic and emotionally charged stories in the history of philosophy. His name was Peter Abelard, and unlike many philosophers remembered primarily for their ideas, Abelard became famous for something far more human. He was a brilliant thinker, a controversial teacher, a relentless challenger of authority, and a central figure in one of the most tragic love stories ever recorded from the medieval world. To understand Abelard, it is important to forget many modern assumptions about the Middle Ages. Popular imagination often portrays medieval Europe as intellectually stagnant, a world governed entirely by religious authority where questioning established beliefs was rare. The reality was more complicated. Beneath the surface, Europe was slowly awakening intellectually. Ancient texts were being rediscovered. Schools were expanding. Scholars were beginning to ask difficult questions about faith, logic, ethics, and human reason. A new intellectual world was emerging, and Abelard would stand at its center. He was born in 1079 in Brittany, a rugged region in what is now northwestern France. His father was a minor nobleman, and according to tradition, Abelard could have pursued the life expected of someone from a social background. He might have become a knight, inherited responsibilities, managed land, and lived a relatively conventional life. Yet from early age, he displayed little interest in military glory or aristocratic ambition. What attracted him instead was argument, not conflict with swords, conflict with ideas. There was something about intellectual debate that fascinated him. While other young men trained for warfare, Abelard became captivated by questions. Why should one believe something simply because an authority declared it true? Could reason uncover truths that tradition overlooked? What happened when respected thinkers contradicted one another? These questions would shape the entire course of his life. As a young man, he left home and began traveling between schools, seeking out the most respected teachers of his era. Medieval education looked very different from modern education. Students often traveled great distances to study under famous masters. Reputation mattered enormously. A gifted teacher could attract students from across Europe. Abelard quickly distinguished himself not merely as a student, but as someone who enjoyed challenging his instructors publicly. This was both his greatest strength and the beginning of many future problems. He possessed an extraordinary confidence in his own intellect. Some contemporaries admired it. Others considered it arrogance. Yet even critics acknowledged his brilliance. He had an unusual ability to detect weaknesses in arguments and expose contradictions that others overlooked. In debates, he was often devastating. Teachers who expected obedience instead found themselves confronted by a young scholar who questioned their conclusions openly. One of the most important figures in his early life was William of Champeaux, a highly respected philosopher and theologian in Paris. Abelard initially studied under him, but soon began criticizing aspects of his teaching. Their disagreements became famous. Students watched as the younger scholar challenged the established master. Remarkably, Abelard often emerged looking stronger. His reputation grew rapidly because he seemed fearless. He was willing to question intellectual authorities in a culture where authority carried enormous weight. This period reveals something essential about his character. Abelard was not driven merely by ambition. He genuinely believed reason had an important role to play in the search for truth. To him, accepting an idea without examination felt intellectually dishonest. If two respected authorities disagreed, then someone had to investigate the contradiction rather than simply ignore it. This attitude sounds familiar today because modern education often encourages critical thinking. In Abelard's world, however, such an approach could easily create enemies. And enemies were something he accumulated rapidly. Yet his growing reputation could not be ignored. By his 30s, he had become one of the most celebrated teachers in Paris, which was beginning to emerge as one of Europe's great intellectual centers. Students flocked to hear him lecture. His classes were crowded. His fame spread. Young scholars wanted to learn from the man whose arguments seemed capable of dismantling even the most respected authorities. What made his lectures so compelling was not merely his intelligence. It was his method. Instead of presenting knowledge as a collection of unquestionable truths, he encouraged investigation. He highlighted contradictions between respected thinkers and forced students to think through problems themselves. One of his most influential works would later collect conflicting statements from religious authorities, inviting readers to wrestle with the tension rather than accept easy answers. This approach was revolutionary because it treated reason not as an enemy of faith, but as a tool for deepening understanding. At the heart of his philosophy was a conviction that would shape much of Western intellectual history. Faith and reason should not exist as enemies. Truth had nothing to fear from honest questioning. If an idea was genuinely true, careful examination would strengthen it rather than destroy it. This belief may sound obvious today, but during Abelard's lifetime, it carried profound implications. It challenged the assumption that intellectual obedience was always preferable to inquiry. Yet even as his intellectual influence expanded, another story was beginning to unfold. It would transform his life completely and ensure that centuries later people would remember not only his philosophical achievements, but also his extraordinary personal tragedy. By the early 12th century, Peter Abelard had become one of the most famous intellectuals in Europe. Students traveled enormous distances to hear him speak. His reputation spread far beyond Paris. In an age before printing presses, before mass communication, before universities as we know them today, this kind of fame was extraordinary. Knowledge moved slowly, yet Abelard's name seemed to move everywhere. Young scholars spoke about him with admiration. Rivals spoke about him with irritation. Church authorities watched him with increasing caution. For Abelard, however, success brought a dangerous temptation. The same confidence that had allowed him to challenge powerful teachers gradually began transforming into something closer to pride. Throughout his life, he had defeated opponents in debate, exposed weaknesses in arguments, and earned admiration through sheer intellectual brilliance. It became easy to believe that reason could solve almost every problem. Easy to believe that he could outthink consequences before they arrived. Then he met Heloise. Few figures in medieval history have captured the imagination quite like her. Even centuries later, her name remains inseparable from Abelard's. Yet she was far more than a supporting character in his story. Heloise was one of the most educated women of her age, a remarkable achievement in a society where educational opportunities for women were extremely limited. She possessed intelligence, literary talent, intellectual curiosity, and a reputation for learning that attracted attention throughout Paris. When Abelard first learned about her, he was intrigued. At the time, Heloise lived under the guardianship of her uncle Fulbert, a canon associated with Notre Dame Cathedral. She was still young, but already recognized for her extraordinary intellect. Abelard arranged to become her tutor, a decision that would change both of their lives forever. At first glance, the arrangement seemed perfectly respectable. A celebrated scholar teaching an exceptionally gifted student. Yet beneath the surface, something far more complicated was developing. Abelard later admitted that he entered the relationship with motives that were far from noble. He was attracted to her beauty, impressed by her intelligence, and confident that he could pursue a romantic relationship without serious consequences. It was a moment revealing a flaw that would appear repeatedly throughout his life. For all his intellectual brilliance, he often underestimated the emotional and social realities surrounding him. What began as lessons soon became a love affair, and not a casual one. The surviving letters between Abelard and Heloise reveal a relationship of extraordinary intensity. Their connection was intellectual, emotional, and romantic all at once. They discussed literature, philosophy, love, and the meaning of life. In many ways, they seem astonishingly modern compared to common stereotypes about medieval relationships. Yet the very qualities that made their relationship powerful also made it dangerous. Abelard was a famous teacher. Heloise was a student. Paris was filled with gossip, and medieval society was not forgiving when social expectations were violated. Eventually, the relationship became impossible to conceal. Fulbert discovered what had been happening and reacted with fury. The situation became even more complicated when Heloise became pregnant. Suddenly, the celebrated philosopher who had spent years winning intellectual battles found himself trapped in a deeply human crisis that no clever argument could solve. Abelard arranged for Heloise to leave Paris temporarily, and she gave birth to their son. Historical accounts suggest they named him Astrolabe, one of the more unusual names in medieval history. The choice itself reveals something about the intellectual world they inhabited. An astrolabe was a sophisticated scientific instrument used for astronomy and navigation. Even in naming their child, they reflected a culture fascinated by knowledge and discovery. The crisis, however, was far from over. Abelard proposed marriage. To modern readers, this may seem like the obvious solution, but the situation was more complicated than it appears. Marriage carried significant implications for Abelard's career and reputation. More surprisingly, Heloise initially resisted the idea. Her reasoning remains one of the most fascinating aspects of their story. She feared marriage would damage Abelard's intellectual future. She argued that his work and reputation were too important to sacrifice. In some of her surviving letters, she appears almost more concerned about his career than her own social standing. It is a remarkable example of how deeply she admired his intellectual mission. Eventually, however, they married in secret. The secrecy itself reflected the impossible pressures surrounding them. They hoped to satisfy Fulbert while protecting Abelard's public reputation. Instead, the arrangement created even greater tension. Fulbert interpreted their efforts at secrecy as a betrayal. Trust collapsed completely. Anger intensified. The situation was moving steadily toward catastrophe. What makes this period so important philosophically is that Abelard was being forced into an experience that would challenge many of his assumptions about human life. For years, he had lived primarily in the world of ideas, arguments, and intellectual competition. Now he was confronting passion, loyalty, fear, jealousy, and social conflict. Human emotions do not behave like logical propositions. They cannot be resolved through debate alone. This lesson would become increasingly painful. One of the great themes running through Abelard's life is the tension between intellect and experience. Knowledge can teach a person many things, but some truths only become visible through suffering. Up to this point, Abelard had often appeared almost invincible. Every challenge seemed to strengthen his reputation. Every controversy increased his fame. But life was preparing a very different chapter. The conflict surrounding Heloise was approaching its breaking point, and the consequences would be devastating. The philosopher who had conquered classrooms and defeated rivals through reason was about to encounter a tragedy that would alter his body, his career, his understanding of himself, and ultimately the direction of his philosophy. The next stage of Abelard's story would not be defined by triumph. It would be defined by loss. The catastrophe arrived with a brutality that would permanently transform Peter Abelard's life. In medieval Europe, honor was not merely a personal feeling. It was a social reality capable of shaping reputations, careers, and entire families. Fulbert believed he had been deceived, humiliated, and betrayed. Whether his anger was justified or not, it eventually consumed him. One night, men acting on his orders entered Abelard's room and carried out a violent act of revenge that shocked medieval society. Abelard was mutilated. The details remain disturbing nearly 1,000 years later, and for Abelard the consequences were devastating. The punishment was intended not simply to injure him physically, but to destroy his identity. In a culture where masculinity, status, and public reputation were deeply connected, the attack threatened to erase the life he had built. The brilliant teacher who had once stood confidently before crowded audiences suddenly found himself overwhelmed by humiliation. For many people, such an event would have ended everything. The loss of reputation alone could have shattered a lesser person. Abelard himself later described the period as one of profound despair. He withdrew from public life and entered a monastery. Heloise, under immense pressure and against her own wishes, eventually entered a convent. In a matter of months, the great love story that had consumed both of them appeared destroyed. Yet this is where Abelard's story becomes more than a tragic romance. It becomes a story about transformation. For years, he had lived as a celebrated intellectual whose confidence sometimes bordered on arrogance. He had challenged authorities, defeated rivals, and gained admiration through the force of his mind. Now he was confronting a reality that no amount of intelligence could reverse. The suffering was personal, irreversible, and deeply humiliating. Many philosophers write about pain. Abelard was now living inside it. One of the remarkable aspects of his life is that he refused to disappear. Despite everything that had happened, he gradually returned to intellectual work. He resumed teaching, continued writing, and once again attracted students eager to learn from him. Yet something had changed. The confidence remained, but it was no longer the confidence of an ambitious young scholar convinced he could conquer every obstacle through reason alone. Experience had humbled him. This change became visible in his philosophical work. Increasingly, he focused on questions about intention, morality, and the inner life. Medieval ethics often emphasized actions themselves. Abelard introduced a more psychologically sophisticated perspective. He argued that understanding a person's intentions was essential for understanding moral responsibility. This may sound obvious to modern listeners, but represented a significant development in ethical thought. Consider two individuals performing the same action. Outwardly, the behavior appears identical, yet internally, their motives may be completely different. One person acts out of compassion, another acts out of selfishness. The visible action tells only part of the story. Abelard believed morality could not be understood properly without examining the intentions behind behavior. This idea seems familiar today because modern psychology and ethics frequently explore motives, beliefs, and internal states. In Abelard's time, however, it represented a shift toward a deeper analysis of human consciousness itself. The philosopher who had once become famous for public debates was increasingly interested in the hidden world inside the human mind. What do people believe? Why do they believe it? When are they genuinely responsible for their actions? Can someone act wrongly while sincerely believing they're doing good? These questions fascinated him because they reflected the complexity of real human life. Human beings are rarely as simple as legal codes or moral rules suggest. People make mistakes. They misunderstand situations. They struggle with conflicting desires. They deceive themselves. They justify actions that later fill them with regret. Abelard had experienced these realities firsthand. His own life was filled with decisions that had produced consequences he never intended. His relationship with Heloise, for example, emerged from genuine affection but also involved pride, secrecy, and poor judgment. The tragedy that followed could not be explained through simple categories of good and evil. Life was messier than that. This realization made his philosophy feel strikingly human. At the same time, his intellectual independence continued creating enemies. Some church authorities grew suspicious of his methods. Abelard loved asking difficult questions, comparing conflicting authorities, and encouraging critical examination. While many admired this approach, others feared it. They worried that too much questioning could undermine established beliefs. One of his most famous works, Sic et non, meaning yes and no, perfectly illustrates his method. Rather than presenting easy answers, Abelard collected apparently contradictory statements from respected religious authorities and placed them side by side. Readers were forced to think carefully about how those contradictions could be reconciled. To Abelard, this was not an attack on faith. It was an expression of intellectual honesty. Truth should survive examination. If respected authorities disagreed, the disagreement should be studied rather than ignored. Yet not everyone appreciated this approach. As his influence grew, so did opposition from powerful figures who believed his confidence in reason threatened religious stability. Among these critics, none would become more significant than Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious leaders of the age. The conflict between the two men was about far more than personal disagreement. It reflected a deeper tension running through medieval civilization itself. How much should faith rely on reason? How far should questioning be allowed to go? Could intellectual inquiry strengthen belief, or would it ultimately weaken it? Abelard stood firmly on one side of this debate. He believed human reason was one of God's greatest gifts and should be used courageously in the search for truth. But the controversy surrounding these questions was only beginning. The philosopher who had survived personal catastrophe was now moving toward an even larger confrontation, one that would place his reputation, his ideas, and his legacy on trial before some of the most powerful voices in medieval Europe. The final chapter of Peter Abelard's life was not defined by romance or personal tragedy, but by a conflict that had been building beneath the surface for decades. It was a conflict between two different visions of how human beings should approach truth itself. On one side stood Abelard, the relentless questioner. He believed faith and reason were not enemies. He believed difficult questions should be examined rather than feared. Contradictions should be investigated rather than hidden. Human beings honored truth not by avoiding inquiry, but by pursuing it courageously wherever it led. On the other side stood powerful figures who worried that too much questioning could become dangerous. They feared that intellectual pride, might place human reasoning above divine authority. They worried that ordinary believers could become confused if every doctrine became an object of endless debate. The most formidable of these critics was Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was not an unintelligent opponent. In many ways, he was Abelard's equal in influence and determination. But the two men viewed the spiritual life very differently. Bernard emphasized humility, devotion, and direct religious experience. Abelard emphasized analysis, logic, and intellectual investigation. Neither man saw himself as an enemy of truth. Yet they disagreed profoundly about how truth should be approached. Their conflict eventually became one of the most famous intellectual confrontations of the Middle Ages. By this point, Abelard was no longer the arrogant young teacher who had dazzled students in Paris. He had suffered humiliation, loss, public scandal, and years of controversy. Yet he remained unwilling to abandon the habits of inquiry that defined his character. He continued writing, continued teaching, continued asking questions. And questions have a strange power. They can inspire progress. They can expose weaknesses. They can challenge assumptions. But they can also make powerful people uncomfortable. In 1140, the tension finally reached its climax. Abelard's teachings were formally challenged, and a council was convened at Sens in France. For Abelard, the stakes were enormous. This was not merely an academic disagreement. His reputation, his work, and his intellectual legacy stood under scrutiny. The outcome was not favorable. Bernard's influence proved overwhelming. Abelard's positions were condemned, and he found himself once again facing public defeat. Yet what makes this moment fascinating is that the victory was not as complete as it appeared. Institutions can condemn ideas. Authorities can silence individuals. But questions often survive long after controversies end. Many of the intellectual methods Abelard championed would continue shaping European thought for centuries. The practice of comparing authorities, analyzing contradictions, and using reason systematically became central to the development of medieval universities. In a sense, the very intellectual culture that emerged after him owed much to the habits of inquiry he helped popularize. History has a way of producing such ironies. The person criticized for asking too many questions sometimes becomes one of the reasons later generations feel free to ask questions themselves. After the council, Abelard's health began to decline. Years of conflict, travel, and emotional strain had taken their toll. Yet, during this final period, something remarkable occurred. The bitterness one might expect from a life filled with controversy seems largely absent from the surviving records. Instead, there's a sense of reflection, a sense of a man looking back across an extraordinary life and recognizing both his achievements and his mistakes. He eventually found refuge at the monastery of Cluny under the protection of Peter the Venerable, one of the most respected religious figures of the age. Unlike many of Abelard's opponents, Peter sought reconciliation rather than conflict. The final months of Abelard's life were far quieter than the turbulent decades that preceded them. He died in 1142. He was approximately 63 years old. For most people, death marks the end of a story. For Abelard, it marked the beginning of another, because after his death, the letters between him and Heloise continued to circulate. Readers discovered not merely a philosopher and a scholar, but two human beings struggling with love, duty, ambition, regret, faith, and loss. Their correspondence became one of the most famous collections of personal letters in Western history. What makes those letters so enduring is their honesty. They are not the words of idealized heroes. They are the words of imperfect people trying to understand experiences that transform them. Love, suffering, disappointment, memory, forgiveness. The same experiences that continue shaping human lives today. In the centuries that followed, Abelard's reputation evolved in fascinating ways. Some remembered him primarily as a philosopher. Others remembered him as a theologian. Many remembered him as one half of the tragic story of Abelard and Heloise. Yet perhaps the most important aspect of his legacy lies elsewhere. He helped push Western thought toward a deeper appreciation of reason. Not reason as cold calculation, not reason as arrogance, but reason as a tool for honest inquiry. He believed faith should not fear questions. He believed contradictions deserved investigation. He believed understanding required effort rather than passive acceptance. These convictions would later influence generations of scholars and contribute to the intellectual culture from which Europe's universities eventually emerged. At the same time, his life offers a cautionary lesson. Intelligence alone does not protect a person from suffering. Brilliance does not eliminate human weakness. Knowledge does not guarantee wisdom. Some of Abelard's greatest struggles emerged not from a lack of intellect, but from the complexities of pride, desire, emotion, and ambition. Perhaps that is why his story remains so compelling nearly 1,000 years later. He was not merely a philosopher writing about human nature from a distance. He lived it. He experienced triumph and humiliation, admiration and condemnation, love and separation, confidence and regret. And through all of it, he continued searching for truth. In the end, Peter Abelard's life reminds us that philosophy is not simply the study of ideas. At its deepest level, it is the study of what it means to be human. The questions that drove him still remain with us today. How should we seek truth? What role should reason play in our lives? How do we balance conviction with humility? How do we learn from suffering without becoming defined by it? Nearly 9 centuries have passed since Abelard walked the streets of medieval Paris. Yet those questions remain unanswered once and for all. Each generation must confront them again. And perhaps that is the clearest sign of his enduring significance. Long after the debates ended and the controversies faded, the questions survived. And sometimes the questions are what matter most.